Hello to my online learners and welcome to the cardiovascular system. Now, this chapter, chapter 13, has a lot of information in it because you're going to do the heart and transport in the heart and conduction of the heart, and also look at blood and a little bit of lymphatic, and we'll continue on with lymphatic later. So we're going to focus on some parts and just briefly go over others. So pay attention to the reading guide so this way you know what areas to focus on. And also, this unit only has 2 weeks and 3 chapters, so make sure you get on it and get going. Okay, so to begin with, we're going to talk about the heart and this cardiovascular system. The cardiovascular system is the means of transporting the nutrients and oxygen to the cells, but also to remove the waste, such as carbon dioxide and other products of cells' metabolism and take them away. And realize that the heart is the pump, or it's actually a double pump, to help move the blood around. When we look at the words, there's quite a few words here. Agglutination, anastomosis, atherosclerosis, arterial sclerosis. You'll see that a lot of things with artery in it have arterial in it. Then you see that there are, hemo is a word for blood, or a term for blood. Ischemia is lack of oxygen. You'll see lots of sites and zones. Have a look at these. Again, don't pay too much attention to all of them because only some of them will need focus at this point. Okay. So when you look at the major components of the circulatory system, we're talking about the heart, the blood, and the vessels that transport it. There's main functions. Quite often you think about transporting blood through the body, which is good, but you also need to pump other substances through the body, or along with the blood. That's kind of vague because there's other things dissolved in the blood. Also, the blood is delivering the vital material and picking up waste. And then we'll talk about a little bit at the end of this chapter, but more when we talk about the lymphatic system. And the lymphatic system will, the cardiovascular system takes fluid to the cells and picks up most of it, but the lymphatic system will pick up the stuff that the circulatory system doesn't. Okay, so we're going to talk about the heart, the blood, and the blood vessels. Now, in some part of your textbook goes into naming all the different blood vessels. I'm not going to get to it at this part. Then when we look at circulation, there's actually a figure 8 or a double pump system. So there is the circulatory system that goes to the lungs, and anything to do with the lungs usually has the word pulmonary or the root pulmonary in it. So pulmonary circulation is the circulation that goes to the lungs. Then you have the blood circulation that goes to the system, so that's the systemic system. Now, what I want you to realize when you're looking at the diagram of the heart is that it is as it is in another person. So the left is the left of the person, the person's left, and the right is the other. So you have to think opposite, which is really important because it's very easy to mix up if you mix up your left and your right. So the right side of the heart will collect blood from the body, pump it to the lungs. The left side of the heart collects it from the lungs and pumps it to the body. Now, in most diagrams, you'll see blue blood as low oxygenated and red blood is oxygenated. Often, arteries and veins are labeled incorrectly or talked about incorrectly. The true definition of an artery is just something that takes blood away. In most circumstances, in all but one circumstance, arteries carry oxygenated blood, but not in the situation of the pulmonary arteries because it's coming from the heart and going to the lungs. So it hasn't been oxygenated yet. So the pulmonary arteries are low oxygenation. Then veins are normally low oxygenation. But here you can see the pulmonary veins, or the veins go back towards the heart. So the pulmonary veins are the veins coming from the lung to the heart have very high oxygenation. Okay? Now, quite often this is drawn as a loop because you've got your body capillaries. The very important part of the double pump is that you very clearly collect the blood from the body, shunt all of it to the lungs, and then bring it back. In some sort of heart defects, you often will have unclear divisions in the pumps, and then you have mixing of the oxygenated and the deoxygenated blood. Okay. Blood is usually depicted as being red or blue. When blood contains high amounts of oxygen, it causes a chemical change with the red blood cells, and it occurs in most arteries. As a result, arterial blood is bright red color with the exception of the pulmonary arteries. Then oxygen is being delivered to the tissues. It turns dark blood mostly in the veins, and that dark red look turns to blue in your hands, and that's why if you look on your hands, you can see your hands look bluish, or your veins in your hands look bluish. Okay? Now, when we look at the heart's about the size of your fist, and it's located slightly to your left. And let's look at the diagram of the heart. There's a lot of words and a lot of terminology in the heart, but if we look at it in terms of function, it's a little easier. So, a reminder, you've got the right side and the left side. There are two types of chambers. There's collecting chambers at the top, called atrium, and there are pumping chambers at the bottom, called ventricles. So, the atrium, not very muscular, they collect. The ventricles will then pump it out of the heart to wherever it's supposed to go. In between the atrium and the ventricle are the atrioventricular valves. Valves are placed anywhere you want a one-way flow of blood. So the main valve between the atrium and ventricular, or atrium and the ventricle, are called the atrioventricular valves. However, you need to give them another name. So the one on the right side is called the tricuspid. The one on the left side is called the bicuspid. And the way I remember this is you like to try things before you buy things, such as like a pair of shoes. So try before you buy. So the tricuspid comes first in the cardiac cycle, and the bicuspid is second. Then when you look at the other valves in the heart, there are valves that prevent the blood from coming backwards when the ventricles relax. So you can see one here. These are called the great vessels. So there's one that leads to the pulmonary artery. So this is the pulmonary valve. And then there's one that comes out of the left ventricle and leads to the aorta. So that's the aortic valve. Now, as a rule, anything coming towards the heart or bringing blood towards the heart is a vein. Anything taking it away is an artery. So this is the superior vena cava, which is a Latin word for the top big vein. This comes from the head and the arms. Then you have the inferior vena cava coming from the bottom. Then that collects it, and then the artery, the pulmonary artery, comes out as a pulmonary trunk, and then it divides into the left and right artery. The blood then goes to the lungs. When it comes back, it's going to come back into the collecting chamber, which is the atrium. So since it's coming back in these vessels, these are veins. Since it's coming from the left lung, this is the left pulmonary vein, and this is the right pulmonary vein, and it comes from the back and goes into the aorta. Into the atrium. Then you have our valve again, and this is the bicuspid valve, also called the mitral valve. I don't know why there needs to be three names for the same thing, and yes, you need to be aware of all of them. So the blood comes in and then gets pumped out, and it'll go to the aorta. Coming off the aorta are three arteries, which go to the head and the arms, and then it turns and goes back and down. So this is quite complex, but I just need you to know the main chambers and the main valves. There's a lot of extra terms here. Just to talk about it, the chordae tendineae are the fancy little strings that hold the flaps together. It's very important for the one-way movement of blood that the valves only go one way. So to prevent them from flapping open, they have these chordae tendineae, which is a fancy word for saying tendon cords. Okay? When you look at the layers of the layers of the heart, you have 3 layers. You have the epicardium, which is the outside layer. Here you have the myocardium, which is the inside layer. And then you also have the endocardium, the myocardium is the muscle layer, and the endocardium is the inside layer. So endo means in, epi means on top of, and myo means muscle. Okay? So that will help you orient. When it comes to naming the heart parts, think of the way the blood flows and find a logic pattern other than just memorizing a bunch of terms. Okay, let's make sure I covered everything. So when the heart, single organ, 2 pumps. The right side collects from the body, sends it to the lungs. The left side collects from the lungs, sends it to the rest of the body. We talked about that. There is a covering around the heart called the pericardium, and it has a bunch of different layers. Don't worry about the bunch of different layers. Just realize that it's the pericardium, and it has layers. And in between them is the pericardial space. In the pericardial space, you want a little lubrication, but whenever you hear about having water on your heart, there's too much fluid in there. Okay? Epi means outer, myo means muscle, endocardium is the lining of the heart, and you want the lining of the heart to be very smooth so that you don't have any sort of disruption of blood flow. Myo is muscle, and that's where that thick cardiac muscle is. There's 4 chambers. The atrium are the top collecting chambers. The ventricles are the lower pumping chambers. Those are alphabetical. A before V, atrium before ventricle. Then there's something called a septum, which is basically the wall in between. The septum between the atrium, right here, the septum between the atrium are called the interatrial septum, and the septum between the ventricles are called the interventricular septum. Those are just parts. We'll talk a little bit about the septum when we talk about the bundle fibers going down. Atrial walls are thinner. We talked about that. The walls of the left ventricle are thicker because they pump to the rest of the body. I'll show that again when you look at it. Veins bring it in, arteries take it away. We've talked about that. Keep blood flowing in the correct direction. There are valves. Very important, because quite often when there's a heart murmur or heart conditions, the valves aren't working right. So there's 2 sets of valves, the atrial ventricular valves, and this is the ones in between the atrium and the ventricles. That's the tri and bicuspid. Then you have the semilunar valves, and these are the valves going to the vessels. So these are the pulmonary and aortic. We talked about the flow. So here is the flow. You can't really tell well on this diagram, but this side of the heart, the left ventricle, is more muscular than the right ventricle. And that's because the left ventricle has to do a bigger pumping job because the blood has to go to the whole body. On the right ventricle, it's just pumping to the lungs, and the lungs are right there, so it's not as big of a task. When we talk about the cardiac cycle, there's the word systole, which is contracting, and diastole, which is relaxing, and the chamber will fill during relaxing. If it's not said specifically, assume ventricle, but please realize your atrium also contracts and your atrium also relaxes. Okay? Good. And this is the end of the video for now, so I'll have to continue with a second video because I'm running out of time.